Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you're joining us from today. My name is Mande Mayangwa, and I am the director of the Wilson Center's Africa program. The Wilson Center, through its Africa program and our partnership with Brown Capital Management, is honored to host this high-level meeting for African sovereign wealth funds on strengthening the role of African sovereign wealth funds in the international financial system, the interplay between policy, governance, and sustainability. Through its Africa program, the Wilson Center works to address the most critical issues facing Africa and US-Africa relations, build mutually beneficial US-Africa relations, and enhance knowledge and understanding about Africa in the United States. Our meeting this week speaks to all of these goals, and our discussion could not be more timely. To officially open our event, I would like to introduce my boss, Ambassador Mark Green, President and CEO of the Wilson Center. I recall that when we last met in Botswana in 2019, Ambassador Green was administrator at USAID, and a number of you had requested his participation in the Botswana meeting as a key US official that you wanted to engage with on the issues of fostering development in Africa and how the United States could work with sovereign wealth funds on this quest. His schedule prevented him from joining us then, but he did send Deputy Assistant Administrator for Africa, Ms. Oren Waishisho. The Wilson Center has since snagged him as our President and CEO, and all this to say that he is someone who probably does not need an introduction. He has a long and distinguished public service career, including serving as president of the McCain Institute, president of the International Republican Institute, US ambassador to Tanzania, and as administrator of USAID from 2017 to 2020, to just before he came to the Wilson Center. He has a passion and commitment to Africa, and his leadership on US Africa is extensive. Ambassador Green, over to you, sir.
Thank you, Monde, and good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us. On behalf of the Wilson Center, I want to welcome all of you to this Brown Capital Management Africa high-level meeting live from the Wilson Center auditorium. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the Wilson Center, we're unlike other think tanks and policy institutes. We were actually established by Congress itself some 5 decades ago for the purpose, in their words, of strengthening the fruitful relation between the world of learning and the world of public affairs. What that really means is that our currency is knowledge, our focus is independent analysis, and our purpose is developing options and ideas that decision makers can believe in. And they can because we are also fiercely nonpartisan. And nowhere is all of this more true than with our Africa program, as you just heard from Monde. Our Africa program serves as the first port of call for addressing critical issues facing Africa, for boosting understanding of what the ignorant once called the dark continent, and most importantly, for shining a very bright light on the possibilities, the great possibilities in U.S.-Africa relations. This meeting on strengthening the role of African sovereign wealth funds in the international financial system is an example of how we at the Wilson Center strive to take up issues and opportunities that, quite frankly, so many others leave behind. And the importance of the sovereign wealth funds to Africa's development and future is really reflected in those of you who are gathered here. We have senior representatives from 16 African countries, represented by the CEOs of national sovereign wealth funds, deputy ministers, and ambassadors. We also have representatives from 9 international and development institutions, including the African Development Bank, the OECD, UNDP, the IMF, and the International Forum for Sovereign Wealth Funds. As someone who has lived in Africa more than once, on the village level and in a capital, I never cease to be amazed at how so many in the West view Africa. They seem to treat African leaders and countries as though they're hopeless and helpless. I am an optimist. I believe that Africa's future is bright, and it's bright because of the vibrancy in the markets and the innovative spirit in its young people. There is so much for Africa to offer. And this generation has so much to offer, not merely for their countrymen and countrywomen, but to the world, if we're only willing to walk with them along the way. We also have academic experts and business leaders who are here today participating in this meeting. We have a marvelous keynote speaker in Ms. Chinelo Anuhu, the Senior Director of the Africa Investment Forum at the African Development Bank, Ms. Catherine Patillo, Deputy Director of the African Department and the IMF, Mr. Felix Nkulukusa, the Government of Zambia's Secretary to the Treasury. We have Cape Verde's Secretary of State of Business Development and Deputy Minister of Finance and Development. I also want to take a moment to thank Brown Capital Management, Mr. Eddie Brown, Mrs. Sylvia Brown, the founders of Brown Capital Management, and Mr. Keith Lee. All of them, by their presence here, show how much this matters to them. And we would not be here. We would not be able to do this kind of work if not for their generosity and support. Since its launch in 2015, the Brown Capital Management Africa Forum has provided a premier platform for substantive and solution-oriented dialogue on key trade, investment, and development issues in Africa. It has also given us a path forward for building closer, stronger, and more productive U.S.-Africa relations. As we look back at the last 7 years of this forum, I'm truly amazed at its many achievements and accomplishments. I'm also amazed at the breadth and the depth of the topics that it's taken on. Wilson Center is grateful for this partnership that allows us to engage, as Monday puts it, in a forward-leaning dialogue. It allows us to put together entrepreneurs and private enterprise and ensure that they remain at the heart of U.S.-Africa relations. Today's event is a follow-up to both our successful 2016 event right here at the center and the 2019 Brown Capital Sovereign Wealth Fund high-level meeting held in partnership with the Bank and Government of Botswana. As government-owned investment funds, sovereign wealth funds serve as critical tools for stabilizing economies, promoting development, and saving and transferring wealth to future generations. In 2021, sovereign wealth funds managed $9.1 trillion, representing 10% of the global gross domestic product. At least 22 African countries have sovereign wealth funds, and several more are considering one or in the process of establishing one. Among other things, this high-level meeting will seek to reflect on and share lessons learned about the impact of global turbulence on the government and the performance of these sovereign wealth funds in Africa. It'll share lessons on achieving profitability while also promoting social responsibility and environmental sustainability. It will explore strategic avenues for facilitating and expanding intra-African and international partnerships, examine ways to strengthen the role of sovereign wealth funds in the international financial system, and how multilateral organizations can best support African sovereign wealth funds. It will provide a forum for peer networking and for countries with established funds to share lessons and best practices for those who were in the process of establishing them. And of course, all of this will lend itself to a discussion of how the U.S. and other partners can work together to strengthen U.S.-Africa economic relations, including African sovereign wealth funds. Now more than ever, it is imperative to have discussions to consider how we move forward during these uncertain times. The COVID-19 pandemic has caused economic challenges that have negatively affected development and the well-being of citizens in Africa and elsewhere around the world. The Russia-Ukraine conflict has further compounded these economic and development changes by including with it the disruption of important supply chains. We were just mentioning earlier today an African businessman that I know quite well who was very involved in agribusiness. He pointed out that the conflict in Ukraine has led to a complete disruption of the supply of fertilizer. And he said, look, all of my farmers have gone into the field without fertilizer. So the challenges that we see this year are nothing compared to the challenges we will see next year. And so this really is a crucial moment for all of us to think about these challenges, but also how do we pursue opportunities that will take us through these challenges? How can sovereign wealth funds also adapt to these changing times? And what role can they play in stabilizing economies and creating that vibrant economic growth that is so key to the continent's future? I look forward to this meeting's dialogue as we exchange wisdom and lessons learned and consider how to best move forward, how to utilize and position sovereign wealth funds to work on behalf of the African people. It is now my pleasure and honor to invite Mr. Eddie Brown, founder and executive chairman of Brown Capital Management, to the stage to provide a few welcome remarks. Eddie, good to see you, and thank you again.
Thank you.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Thank you, Ambassador Green, for the introduction. And on behalf of Brown Capital Management, I would like to thank all of you for joining us today for the Brown Capital Management Africa Forum high-level meeting, strengthening the role of African sovereign wealth funds in the international financial system, interplay between policy, governance, and sustainability. Now that's a mouthful. I want each of you to repeat that. I would also like to thank our partners at the Wilson Center and the Africa Program for their support in organizing and hosting this two-day event. Ambassador Green mentioned the Brown Capital Management Africa Forum as a platform for substantive, policy-oriented dialogue on key trade, investment, and sustainable development issues in Africa. Africa does not nearly get the attention that it deserves. And too often, that attention is focused on its challenges, not on its opportunities. We at Brown Capital are proud to support and partner with the Wilson Center to shine the spotlight on Africa's economic development, both its challenges as well as its opportunities, and the potential for stronger, mutually beneficial U.S.-Africa economic engagement. Over the past 7 years, Brown Capital Management Forum, we have hosted 17 events, published 8 policy papers, and focused on the key development issues in Africa and the U.S.-Africa economic relations. We have also convened over 1,500 U.S., African, and international policymakers and officials, business leaders and practitioners, as well as subject matter experts. We've covered a lot of ground, from discussing U.S.-Africa economic relations at the state level and the significance of the African continental free trade area, unpacking the drivers of Africa's ongoing economic transformation, and examining the role of the business sector in Africa's peace building. We have analyzed the implications of changing global trade architectures and supply chain challenges, and explored ways to maximize the participation of women in Africa's economic development. Early on in its establishment, the Africa Forum recognized the critical role of the potential of sovereign wealth funds to transform Africa's economic development, yet these institutions were not widely known, particularly as they related to Africa. As a result, the Africa Forum decided to focus the spotlight on African sovereign wealth funds to provide a forum where key stakeholders could gather to share experiences, collaborate to advance sovereign wealth funds' agendas. As previously mentioned, this meeting is the third event in a series of successful Brown Capital Management Africa Forum meetings on sovereign wealth funds. The first two events discussed the role of sovereign wealth funds in long-term sustainable development on the continent, as well as policies and best practices for securing the future. It is good to see so many of you here for our meeting from Gaborone, including our partners at the Bank of Botswana. We look forward to continuing our discussion here in Washington by picking up where we left off in Botswana. The theme of today's sessions, Sovereign Wealth Funds in Turbulent Times, Assessing the Current Landscape, is a fitting start to our discussion about strengthening the role of sovereign wealth funds in the international financial system. And it's basically continuing the first two sovereign wealth fund events. As has been expressed by Ambassador Green, and as we have experienced in the past few years, the world is changing at a rapid rate, and it's imperative that governments, especially financial systems, adapt along with it. I look forward to the meetings, the important dialogues and insights, and I want to thank once again all of you, and to thank our partners at the Wilson Center, and especially to Dr. Monday Muyangwa. Thank all of you for attending.
Thank you, Ambassador Green and Mr. Brown, for officially opening and welcoming our delegates to this meeting. It is now my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Ms. Chinelo Onohu, who is the Senior Director of the Africa Investment Forum at the African Development Bank, the flagship initiative of the African Development Bank dedicated to raising capital, advancing projects to bankable stage, and accelerating the financial closure of impactful transactions in Africa. Prior to joining the African Development Bank, Ms. Onohu served as a Director General of the National Pension Commission of Nigeria for 5 years. She had played a pivotal role in the enactment of the Nigerian Pension Reform Act of 2004, which established the National Pension Commission and introduced a contributory pension scheme. Ms. Onohu also has a long track record in formulating investment strategies, and she brings extensive knowledge of institutional investment practice and experience in attracting new capital, expertise in the development of innovative asset classes spanning pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, private equity, and private family wealth funds. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Ms. Onohu to the podium for her keynote remarks. Ms. Onohu, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Monday. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's indeed a great pleasure to attend the Brown Capital Management Africa Forum, third high-level meeting on sovereign wealth funds. I'd like to commend specifically Ambassador Mark Green, the President, Director, and CEO of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, for the invitation, and Mr. Eddie Brown and his lovely wife, who I happen to see here, Executive Chairman and Senior Portfolio Manager of the Brown Capital Management, for his social investment in this notable program. I'm deeply honored to present this keynote speech on the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on the investment landscape of Africa, the importance of sovereign wealth funds to Africa's future, the key issues in the African Sovereign Wealth Fund, and how we can all work together to unleash the potentials of the sovereign wealth funds in the post-COVID era. I'd like to talk a little bit about the African Investment Forum, which is championed by the African Development Bank and its 7 founding partners, Africa 50, who I see in the background somewhere, Africa Finance Corporation, AfroExim, Development Bank of South Africa, European Investment Bank, Islamic Development Bank, and the Trade and Development Bank. is a multi-stakeholder, multidisciplinary platform that has demonstrated strong partnerships and collaboration since its inception in 2018. The AIF, as the Africa Investment Forum is known, its core objectives are to advance projects to bankable stages, raise capital to mobilize partners and investors, and accelerate deals to financial closure. The AIF occupies a unique position on the continent with its ability to crowd in public and private sector financing for transformative projects with a huge developmental impact. We're not a talk shop. We measure our successes one transformative transaction at a time. We have just returned from the US-Africa Business Summit in Marrakesh, where more than 2,000 participants convened to invest in Africa with a sense of excitement that was electrifying and goes beyond aid and the usual dotting the I's and crossing the T's. There was a sense of interest in action, interest in getting things done. During that summit, the AIF, along with one of its founding partners, Africa 50, participated in a panel with the US and African institutional investors, fund managers, and stakeholders to discuss investment challenges and opportunities in Africa. There was over $45 million in that represented in that room. The president of Botswana was also represented in that room. And the president of the African Development Bank, President Adesina, was also in that room. And the talk was again, how do we get things done? And in addition, the AIF also showcased the Memorandum of Understanding it had with the U.S. Trade and Development Administration, the USTDA, which was signed last November to share deal flows and utilize the project preparation expertise of USTDA along with the AIF's unsurpassed convening capacity. It was a privilege to stand with the USTDA Director, Eno Ebong, and the White House Senior Advisor, Dana Banks, amongst others, to discuss women as investment champions, delivering solutions for Africa's infrastructure, and bring a proper lens to the role women can play, not just at this SME level, but also at the multi-billion-dollar deal levels. I bring this power of this partnership to this transaction, to this engagement today, and I hope we'll be able to delve further on how we can all work together. The COVID pandemic has had unparalleled and debilitating impacts on growth prospects across Africa. It has pushed 40 million more people into extreme poverty in the sub-Saharan Africa, eroding 2 decades of developmental gains in achieving the SDGs. The pandemic has also further exposed the weaknesses of Africa's physical and social infrastructure and the fragility of its largely poor population, especially the women. It has, in the uncertain post-COVID era, in the aftermath of the crisis, and with the specter of a protracted war with Russia and Ukraine, Africa cannot be caught in the middle between geopolitical competitors, nor can it afford to be left behind. Africa needs to become the safe space for the deployment of capital, for the repositioning of supply chains, and the place for high returns on investment. In addition to these challenges that have been exposed, incredible opportunities have also come to light. Chief amongst those is the urgent need for manufacturing on the continent, rather than sole reliance on imports from elsewhere. To achieve the SDGs international climate commitments, United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, UNCTAD, estimates that Africa needs to invest $1.2 billion per year. However, the current rate of investment is only about $660 million, barely half of that. As the world emerges from the challenges of the pandemic, most African countries need financing for their post-COVID recovery, especially in the critical infrastructure, to build back economies that are better positions to shield from global external shock and future pandemics, because the COVID-19 is just one. More will come. We had Ebola, and today's COVID-19, there may be more in future. So our solutions are not centered around specific events, but all events that may possibly emerge. And this, given the elevated debt levels and risks in the continent, as well as the increased cost of borrowing due to rising inflation in the world's major economies, the local institutional investors, in particular the sovereign wealth funds, are needed more than ever to channel both longer-term domestic savings and resources and revenues to productive uses, which can help drive more sustainable macroeconomic growth. And which is why the interplay between policy and government, that is the theme of this, is more crucial now than ever. Africa's first sovereign wealth fund, I believe, would be the Botswana Pula Fund, was established in 1994. And since then, to date, there are at least 22, maybe 24, more still coming in, have sovereign wealth funds, and several more considering are in the process of establishing this fund. As government-owned investment funds, sovereign wealth funds serve as key tools for stabilizing economy. Key emphasis, stabilizing economy. And that in itself understands that there might be instability from time to time. Supporting domestic development and transferring wealth to future generations. Since the pandemic, sovereign wealth funds have increasingly focused on investing at home. According to the data from International Forum of Sovereign Wealth Funds, in 2020, the sovereign wealth funds brought about $12.7 billion in new investments directly into companies and projects in their domestic economies, more than triple the amount made in 2019. In Africa, this trend of looking inward for sovereign wealth fund investment brings new opportunities for financing critical infrastructure and human capital projects. Further development and appropriate regulation of local sovereign wealth funds can potentially enable these financial institutions to evolve and become important sources of longer-term financing, including, and specifically, infrastructure. However, we are aware that sovereign wealth funds are often held back from investing optimally in infrastructure and other critical asset classes, partly due to the fact that their mandates are not fully aligned with the innovative structures that have emerged in today's Africa. And they may also lack the familiarity and skills needed to identify and evaluate quality projects. And this is a gap that the African Investment Forum stands ready to fill. As the preeminent investment platform in Africa, the AIF leverages the convening power of the African Development Bank and its founding partners to attract the best projects on the continent. It employs a rigorous vetting mechanism to ensure that only the best transactions are presented to both domestic and global investors. It also very closely monitors the nature of these investments, the political landscape, and also the catalysts to ensure that the rates of returns are protected. During the pandemic, AIF and its founding partners initiated a unified COVID-19 response, under which 13 projects were identified across 5 relevant sectors: agriculture and agro-processing, energy, health, ICT and telecoms, industry and trade were considered for funding. These projects have a collective value of $3.68 billion, and they are currently at different stages of advancement and have already shown that they will help advance Africa's self-sufficiency and resilience against future shocks. To date, the AIF has curated over 300 deals, screened about 188 of these, valued at approximately US 170 billion, and attracted investment interest for about USD 116 billion. In this year's virtual boardrooms held in March alone, 136 originated deals were screened, while 41 deals valued at $57.8 billion were successfully curated for the boardroom presentations. These deals have drawn a total of $32.8 billion in confirmed investment interests. For co-investment opportunities, the AIF presently offers projects across 32 African countries, spanning all the critical sectors and even the not so critical sectors, which we clearly see will play a role in the future. Besides the return on investment, the AIF emphasizes projects that result in the biggest developmental impact, ensuring that the investment do not only benefit the project sponsors and investors, but also the end users. For our 2021 boardroom deals alone, around 3.8 million jobs are expected to be created, both direct and indirectly, with 1 million jobs specifically targeting women and women entrepreneurs. AIF also provides international investors a safe entry point for their in-Africa investments. All our deals are located on the continent, nowhere else. Despite evidence of strong economic growth on the continent, we do admit that investing in Africa is often deemed risky, partly due to non-understanding of the landscape and due to a clear and present danger and challenge of political and security challenges in some markets. In this regard, the AIF capitalizes on the vast expertise provided by its 7 founding partners and provides a one-stop for global investors and domestic as well, offering quality pre-cleared projects as well as superior business intelligence to unlock the bottlenecks where they exist. Financing the ambitious development agenda ahead calls for an enhanced role of the sovereign wealth funds. They're doing a lot. They can do more as strategic investors who will support the rise of the local and regional financial markets. We've had issues of the markets, the capital markets on the continent not being deep enough. The sovereign wealth funds can play that role as the catalytic role in deepening the financial markets. We are also interested in seeing the sovereign wealth funds play a larger role in the financing of the larger scale regional projects, the industrialization agenda of the continent. In view of the above, in a context of post-COVID recovery and with the aim of accelerating Africa's transformation, it will be hugely appropriate for sovereign wealth funds to participate in the AIF boardrooms as the first strategic investors in the projects from the continent. Given the transactional nature of the AIF platform, a lot of our global investors get comfort in the skin in the game of the sovereign wealth funds, and this is what we offer, a co-investment platform. I look forward to a fruitful discussion on the evolving role of the sovereign wealth funds and our collaborative efforts in fostering the intra-African and international partnerships to advance the sovereign wealth funds in Africa future. This is a collaboration will continue as we head to the AIF 2022 Market Days in November and to the Africa Leaders Summit here in Washington, D.C. in December. Finally, I would like to close my remarks by congratulating the Biden-Harris administration on the launch of its Africa policy this week by Secretary Tony Blinken in South Africa. From what I have gathered, the strategy recognizes the centrality in the private sector in driving economic development and poverty alleviation and looks to empower women and youth. I will also look forward to the actual implementation of that policy, and you will find the AIF and indeed the African Development Bank as strong institutional partners for these ambitions. My thanks goes to Dr. Muyangwa and her team for putting this together, and I thank you all for being here, and I look forward to more discussions later on. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Anoho, for getting us to a great start with your keynote. Covered a lot of ground there, set the stage nicely for a number of issues that we will be addressing during the course of this meeting, so we appreciate that. We have time for 3 to 4 questions, and if you would like to ask a question or make a comment, just raise your hand. I will acknowledge you. Someone will bring you a microphone, and just keep it to about a minute so we can get those 3 to 4 questions in. Uche, I'm going to come to you first because you were instrumental in working with us to focus on this topic. So if you give the microphone to Uche, see what he has to add, and then I'm going to come to Governor Pelayo. I don't see where is he? Governor, oh, good, you're seated perfectly. So we'll go to Governor Pelaelo from Botswana, so you can sort of link some of the issues that Ms. Janello has talked about with what we discussed in Botswana and how we come forward. So Uche, you first.
When you think about the opportunities in the continent today, I think we need to elevate the conversations and the sizes of what's needed to be done to create the level of impact that we need to have made in the continent. The second thing, so the third thing, so we've talked about energy transition and the impact, the ticket sizes need to be up. And the third thing is obviously what Dr. Chinelo mentioned, which I think the need to work on the diversity within the continent. We are beginning to emphasize and back small women-led funds in our pool of portfolio managers. And I think the reason that is very important is because the role that women play in our continent needs to be discussed in a slightly different way. We have noticed a number of things. Number one is education that goes just beyond the primary level or secondary level is very important. Two, encourage them through their careers. And three, actually actively backing those funds as a way to actually encourage and create role models for future women who play roles in our continent. They are, unfortunately, victims of some of the worst issues that we face in our continent. And I like the fact that she raised it, and I think it's something that we all need to be working on. But I think these are the points I really want to make, and it's dangerous to give a microphone this early in the morning. Thank you.
No, great. Let me ask Ms. Onohu, do you want to make a quick comment, and then I'll turn it to Governor Pelaelo. And if there's another head of a sovereign wealth fund who want to make a quick comment after that, please just raise your hand, and I will acknowledge you. So, Ms. Janello, you want to make a quick comment to?
Well, that would be in agreement because, and especially with regards to the energy transition, that's a burning question that we are addressing right away. Again, through the way we believe through transactions, because once you put together a transaction, it addresses the issues that are there. What are we doing about fossil fuels? What are we doing about renewable energy, and how can we marry the two? And the question is it one or the other? And recent timing has shown us that we can actually do both. So yes, I totally agree with Uche's comment. Thank you.
Thank you.
And sorry, just to respond to the big ticket sizes that he said, because I think it's crucial. And not just the sovereign wealth funds, a lot of domestic investors, a lot of domestic capital managers and all tend to shy away from big ticket deals simply because of the amount of work that is needed, and also wondering whether there is the expertise to attack those big tickets. But we have seen that unless we pull together transactions to be big enough to even attract the kind of investment we're looking for, it will not happen. And one of these issues, we have the Lagos-Abidjan Highway deal. It's a $15 billion deal, which is on the AIF platform, and we're trying to accelerate it to financial closure. It's not only a useful to do, but it's needed that countries, companies, investors pull together to attack these big ticket funds so that the institutional investors, the sovereign wealth funds, or the pension funds out of all the other countries would be able to play in this field. And this is something Africa has woken up to, and they're working towards it. So yes, thank you, Uche, for mentioning that.
Your sister thanks you for setting her up nicely for that response, so thank you. Governor Pelaelo, before I come to you, just wanted to quickly acknowledge Ambassador Mathilde from Rwanda. Thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate your support. Sorry I didn't acknowledge you early on, but I just noticed you had walked in, so thank you. Appreciate you. Yes, and also one of our biggest supporters, Ambassador Suka Mafudze, the African Union ambassador to the United States. I acknowledge your presence as well. Thank you so much for joining us for this important discussion. My sisters are out in full force, so this is good. Governor Pelaelo.
Thank you very much.
It's on.
Okay, thank you very much. Let me start by thanking you very much, particularly Ambassador Green, and of course the team here at the Wilson Center, and of course Brown Capital Management, Mr. Eddie Brown. We really appreciate the opportunity to be part of this very important meeting. high-level meeting on this very important topic on sovereign wealth funds, particularly the emphasis on policy governance and sustainability. I think, to our guest speaker, just one question around the question of investing in the domestic economy by sovereign wealth funds, particularly those such as the Pula Fund, which is a component of the foreign exchange reserves of Botswana. The other angle, again, in the context of a country very prone to climate risks, droughts and other things, how do we look at this question of ESGs and whether embed them or calibrate our investment strategies around the ESGs? It's a very difficult question these days, and everybody talks about this whole green bonds and others and so forth. And so we would really appreciate a comment from the African Development Bank in terms of what assistance can you render people like us in terms of trying to understand this ESG. I thank you. Thank you, Dr. Mo.
Thank you. Please.
Okay, so one question at a time, I guess. Yeah. Okay, I think that works as well. Thank you very much. It's good that you bring the issue of the ESGs on board, because it's very important for the African continent, which, as we speak now, suffers disproportionately to the level of climate upheaval in the world, when they have contributed very little, and yet they are bearing the brunt. What we continue to do is to ensure that there's a seamless approach, because like you rightly pointed out, the ESG principles and the green bonds and the whole climate change have been so politicized that we're losing meaning. And we need to be very careful on the continent to adopt what works for the continent, while also adhering to what works for the entire globe, because the African continent remains a part of the globe. So to this end, there's a lot of work already ongoing for establishing an ESG set of principles that govern transactions. Again, on the African Investment Forum, we pull it down to transactions so that we can see the work of it. So it's not merely theoretical. There's also a lot of funding available within not just the AFDB. I know the TDB and I know the Africa Finance Corporation is also doing a lot of in-depth study on what will work for the continent and how to proceed. And all of these people are setting out funds, especially to ensure that it is directed towards areas such as yours. Your president in Marrakesh was very, very passionate about the curation of projects that will take the nation's particularities into consideration and not just following that. So work is ongoing. Just to answer your question, the African Development Bank remains available for funding, and indeed has partnered with the Global Action Climate and other international bodies to pull together funds that could be deployed appropriately to assist the issues that are emanating from climate change. On the Africa Investment Forum, we are working on establishing a global set of investment principles that cover the ESG, so that we don't talk about green bonds, we don't talk about green investment. We want to ensure that every investment is greened. Every investment adheres to the principles, so that we remove this special toga around them and ensure that we mainstream them through all of the investments, because a lot of the facilities in the continent are yet to be built. It doesn't hurt for them to be built right, rather than walking back from things that are not. So thank you. Hope that answers your question.
No, thank you. So I have time for one more question, but don't worry. This is just the beginning of 2 days. So there'll be plenty of time for us to engage. I will take just one, if you can keep it to a minute, and then we will close things. No, please, please. Definitely. I know you had raised your hand earlier. Can we get a mic up front, please? Thank you. So we'll take this as a last question, but I acknowledge you as well. We will get to you during the course of our conversations in the next 2 days.
Thank you for giving us this opportunity. It was not a question, but just a comment. Since we are on the keynote session, and we have the opportunity to have with us Victoria from the SWF, and we are talking about sovereign wealth fund, perhaps she can give us some insight about that for 1 minute, perhaps.
She will. She's on a session, so she'll be doing that in that session, if you don't mind. Yeah. No. So thank you.
There's still one more question.
Just the final one over here, and then we'll cross things. Victoria, I love you, but we will get to you. All right.
Just one. I think in your keynote address, you talked about the West or other people not understanding the landscape, but not necessarily to yourself, but to the whole room. Do we understand each other's landscape? As a continent, do we have the proper governance structures around our organizations that our brothers and sisters in other countries can trust us with their investment funds? Thank you.
That's a loaded one.
Absolutely, absolutely.
I will give you a minute to respond to that. I'm sure we'll be talking about, there's a session that we have actually that will be talking about intra-African collaboration.
Yeah,
so I know we'll get into
that's where I was
detail on
going.
that.
So thank you very much for that. Like Dr. Monday said, loaded question. But it will be absolutely naive and utopian to think that 54 countries will speak the same voice. And so if that understanding doesn't exist, that is part of what the African Development Bank, the Africa Investment Forum, the AFC, that these are the things we seek to foster. We have the African Free Continental Free Trade Agreement. The implementation is anchored on that understanding. So what I would answer you in a nutshell is that indeed we do understand each other. What we have to show is that understanding with the sincerity of purpose. And this is work in progress. It's never going to end. So what we keep working on is to put together platforms to air disagreements, to have different opinions, because we can't possibly see things differently. But we have an opportunity to leverage on our differences for the promotion of the continent. And it is the mindset in that leveraging that will determine whether we succeed or fail. Thank you.
And that is a powerful way to end this keynote. So please join me in thanking Ms. Onohu for her keynote. And for those of you joining us online, we thank you for tuning in to the Wilson Center, to this webcast, and for joining us. I think you'll also be able to join us for the closing ceremony. Is that going to be webcast? Yes. So we look forward to welcoming you back for the readout on the meeting in 2 days. We will send out that invitation. But thank you so much for joining us today. What I would like to do is take time to take a few photos with our keynote speakers. So for now, what I'd like to do is invite members of the Brown Capital leadership team to please come up. My co-moderator for this meeting, Dr. Gilpin, we will take a first set of photos, and then I'm going to invite the principals of the African Sovereign Wealth Funds to come up for the photo, and then I'll invite the African ambassadors in the audience to come up for the photo. So let me start with Brown Capital Management and Wilson Center Leadership for the photo.